So this afternoon we'll talk about Mizrakhi music. Maybe? Yes. So this is, broadly speaking, music from Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa, and their diasporas as well. It's really a worldwide phenomenon. I'd like to start with a little story about some of the musicians you see in this picture. This is a picture of Saleh and Daoud al-Kuwaiti. Saleh was a violinist, and Daoud was an oud player. They were brothers. As their name suggests, there's some Kuwaiti background in their family, but they're actually Iraqi. They were born in Kuwait, and the family returned to Iraq when they were quite young. The boys showed a lot of talent on their respective instruments. They became very successful musicians in their teenage years, and they built a sound that really brought together innovation with some of the traditional Iraqi sounds. They collaborated with most of the major performers in those days, and they even won the favor of the Iraqi king Ghazi bin Faisal, and amassed in the process quite a fortune and a lot of property. But as you may know, around the time that Israel was being formed in 1948, the conditions for Jews in Iraq and many, if not all, Middle Eastern countries became untenable. The al-Kuwaiti brothers immigrated with their families to Israel in the early 1950s, where they were met with prejudice from the European establishment there. Really, Israel was a European country at the time. We don't necessarily think of it as such. And their music was really not of interest to the European cultural establishment. So they, instead of performing in major concert halls and the like, they became itinerant musicians. And they had to appear at sort of what they would consider low-level festivals, or what were called haflas, these big family gatherings. And eventually, they opened up a housewares store in Tel Aviv. And that's how they made ends meet. And not only were they sort of discouraged themselves, but they ended up discouraging and really forbidding their own children from playing music. It's a sad story, but their music does exist. We have some recordings. I'm going to play one for you now. This is a tune called Shway Shway, and you'll hear the virtuosity of both of the brothers and their band, and also listen to some of the stylistic techniques and different movements within the piece, because we're going to get back to a lot of that as we move along. Forgot how long that piece of music is.
Was that a high-pitched instrument?
In the beginning?
Yeah.
It was a violin, actually. Yeah, so it's an old recording.
I was going to ask, what year?
This would probably be, somewhere in the 40s, 30s. So the language you heard was Arabic, and this would have been Arabic popular music in the day. These were secular performers. As I mentioned yesterday, and the theme will come up again, the collaboration of Jews and Muslims was normal. They made music together. They spoke the same musical languages. They spoke the same languages, right? So this kind of a collaboration for them, living in Iraq, would have been commonplace in a way. And again, they sort of faced this realization when they came to Israel that they weren't quite as welcome as they actually had been in Iraq. I'm going to play another musical example. This time, I would love for you to listen for the text. It may be familiar to you, even as the music might not be. So let's see if you can identify what text is being sung. And I'm going to go to the next slide, too, because this is not from the brothers here. This way. There's beautiful Alhambra. Anyone been there before?
Oh.
It's quite a remarkable place. We'll get back to that in a moment. Does that sound what Kol Nidre to you? Right. So this is actually an example from Spain. It's from an album of actually called Alhambra, which is the art of Judeo-Spanish music. I couldn't track down the performers themselves, but the text of Kol Nidre we know of as kind of the high point of the Kol Nidre service, right? The service for the evening of Yom Kippur. And in the Ashkenazi world, we have a very fixed understanding of what that tune is supposed to sound like. And this wasn't it, of course. But the text, Kol Nidre, I think has also historically been misidentified as originating from Spain. That's one of the reasons why I chose this. I don't know if you heard that myth. I'm just dispelling it here for those of you who believe this myth. But the idea came about actually in the 1940s in the Reform movement, as I recall. They wanted to trace the impact of this text, of the Kol Nidre text, which talks about you know, absolving ourselves of all of our vows and promises, etc. But they wanted to understand that in a context that would make sense for the 20th century. The Kol Nidre text had been somewhat problematic in the Reform movement for many years prior. So they wanted to basically bring the text back, but give it a backstory, which was that this was a text that originated in Spain, which again it didn't, that Spanish Jews would confess or profess because they didn't want to, they were conversos basically, right? Where they made this vow, this promise to be Christians, but that didn't matter, that they were still Jewish. So it became a very evocative mythology that actually is not at all true. So again, just throwing that out there in case anyone was swept away by that story. In fact, Kol Nidre isn't an Aramaic legal formula, right? It's actually a very dry piece of text, very boring actually, and it's not a prayer. It doesn't mention God. It's one of the reasons why many humanistic and secular communities still do Kol Nidre.
Without changing a word.
Right, you don't even have to change it. But the exact date of its composition is unclear. Probably it originated in what's known as the Gaonic period, which is a period in history in Babylonia where it's kind of post-Talmudic period, meaning that we now have the Talmud and now there are scholars who are taking up the mantle of, sort of taking the mantle from the rabbinic authorities of the Talmud and establishing their own place of authority in Babylonia, in two places, Sura and Pumbedita. But anyway, during this period is probably when this text came about, somewhere in the 8th or 9th century. And it probably originated as a popular text as well, because it's in Aramaic, which was the vernacular. Again, it's not a prayer, but it modeled a legal formula that would have been familiar to the people at that time. And again, it functions in this very important way in the Yom Kippur liturgy, where it serves to symbolically wipe away our vows and promises and allows us to start the year with a clean slate, as it were. Now this particular place, Alhambra, is a palace or fortress complex located in Granada, in Andalusia, or Al-Andalus as it's known in Arabic, in southern Spain, about an hour's drive from the Mediterranean coast. And it was built on the remnants of a Roman fortress, renovated and rebuilt in the 13th century by Nasrid Amir Muhammad bin Al-Ahmar of the Emirate, or the political territory of Granada, also known as the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. Now in this music that you heard, there's quite a bit of musical sharing. Again, the theme comes up where not only with the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, but what we just heard with Kol Nidre, the music itself is not that different from the music that you might hear in a non-Jewish setting. Of course, here we have a Jewish text, but sung to a style of music that wouldn't be unfamiliar to someone who is familiar with Arabic music. So prior to the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and I think was mentioned yesterday, there were really two expulsions. There was also the Portuguese expulsion about 5 years later. But Sephardic Jews comprised a very important minority population in the Iberian Peninsula. And under Muslim rule, which began in the year 711, which is an easy date to remember, and then eroded in the 14th century with the Reconquista, the Catholic takeover. But during that period, it's known as the Golden Age. Again, much romanticized, but it was golden to some extent. And Jews in those days mingled very closely with their non-Jewish neighbors, both Muslims and Christians. And they enjoyed, that is, the Jews and the Christians enjoyed relative freedom as protected minorities. So, although the Caliphate, as I sort of alluded to, treated the Jews differently at different times, it wasn't always so rosy, but more or less, what emerged was a general atmosphere of tolerance, cooperation, and collaboration. And the cultural life in Al-Andalus benefited greatly from these mutual influences. For example, in the 11th century, a genre of poetry emerged with Jewish poets who were writing in Hebrew, a style called the piyutim, or liturgical poetry. And these poems were actually based on the strophic and metrical patterns of Arabic poetry. And very similarly, when they started to write the Ladino romanceros or romanzas, these similarly adopted the meters and rhythms and forms of classical Arabic poetry. There was a lot of cross-fertilization. And musically, Jewish and non-Jewish musicians worked very closely together, borrowing each other's melodies, sharing vocal techniques and instrumental techniques, musical structures, melodic structures, rhythmic devices, and what we will discuss as modes or melodic formulas. Jews and non-Jews played at each other's weddings and essentially used the same musical vocabularies, as I mentioned. And what's interesting too, within their respective communities, there really wouldn't be much difference between the secular or the sacred music either. You just change the words, the music more or less stays the same. So, here's my next slide. What's on that one? Oh, look at that, musical aspects. So, this is what we'll talk about today. There are 4 areas that I think we should focus on that I've sort of arbitrarily, or not, identified as 4 main musical aspects of Mizrachi music. One is the makam, which we were introduced to yesterday, the melodic modes used in traditional Arabic music. There's also microtonality, which is the use of intervals smaller than a half tone. Really smaller than a quarter note, right? So in this music, sometimes it will sound out of tune. Maybe that was an impression that some of you had. As Western listeners, because we're not trained in the nuances of that vocabulary, it might just sound a little bit off to us. I know I have friends with perfect pitch who just can't listen to a lot of ethnic music because it doesn't fit their framework. But you'll hear a lot of that, and you already have with the what might sound like sliding into notes, sliding out of notes, that kind of a thing. There's also improvisation, which plays a very important role. The extemporaneous musical composition or embellishment, and we've already heard a bit of that as well. And lastly, heterophony, which is the simultaneous variation of a unison melodic line. A lot of what we receive as sort of the texture, the fabric of the music, doesn't come from harmony in the way that we understand it in the West, but rather a number of instruments or voices doing the same line with slight variation that create texture. And we will hear examples of all of this. So many of these elements were actually already present in Spain and would be carried into the Sephardic diaspora of the Middle East, North Africa, Iran, and with subsequent migrations elsewhere into parts of India, as we'll talk about a little bit later, and elsewhere in Asia, Central and Southern Asia, places like Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, the Caucasus, Kurdistan, and Afghanistan. And today, apparently about 60% of Israelis claim Mizrachi heritage in whole or in part as well. So there's a major, not only presence of Mizrachi Jews in Israel, but a musical presence of Mizrachi music in Israel, Jewish Israel. So just to recap a little bit about what got these Jews into their specific Sephardic diaspora. The Catholic reconquest of Spain really accelerated with violent attacks around 1391. There were a lot of mass conversions that took place. Not only Jews, but also Muslims at that time. In 1478, the Catholic monarchs Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon established the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which aimed really to enforce the orthodoxy of Jewish and Muslim conversos. That is, people who converted but maybe were practicing, or at least suspected of practicing, their former religion in secret. So the Alhambra Decree, which is really what we understand today as the expulsion decree of 1492, ordered the expulsion of practicing Jews specifically. And the reason for that was that, the thought anyway, was that expelling practicing Jews would minimize or eliminate their influence, their Judaizing influence, on conversos. That without a Jewish presence in Spain, the conversos themselves would have no reference point and they would be more sincere converts. That was the intention behind it. So, just as we saw in Spain with these kind of close cultural contacts and collaborations, these would continue into the Sephardic diaspora, where Jews forged close musical ties with their non-Jewish neighbors. And what resulted was a remarkable degree of hybridity, meaning that different styles and different, again, musical quirks and languages were fused together. And this happened not only in music, but of course in cultural life generally. So if we look at the music, certainly in the cantillation, the biblical chant of Sephardic Jews living in Middle Eastern countries, we hear a really distinct, as we'll hear in some examples, influence of the surrounding style of chant. Basically, the Islamic chant becomes the Jewish chant, maybe vice versa. You know, there is always, to some extent, some cultural exchange. But it also resulted in new languages being formed, like Judeo-Arabic, and also Hakatiya, which I think was mentioned yesterday, a specific language of Morocco that blends Spanish, Moroccan Arabic, and Hebrew. And the divisions between sacred and secular were really freely crossed. So you see some of these piyutim, some of these prayers, sung to the same melody as a romancero or a lullaby even, using the same melody. Again, this is the process of contrafaction. This being very much a mode of musical expression as well. If there's a very sturdy or durable melody, it can be used in a lot of different contexts, not only in Arabic context or Muslim context and Jewish context, but even within the Jewish context, used in multiple ways. So, as a result, Jewish musicians were very comfortable, as the Al-Kuwaiti brothers were, playing with non-Jews, sharing each other's repertoires, and developing a musical language that in some sense we hear is very Arabic, but there's a Jewish presence there as well. Many of these countries post-1948 have tried to wipe away the history of Jewish musicians who were, you know, stars in the early recording days or what have you. And their presence is still there, even as their names are forgotten. You hear the remnants of their innovations, even in the sounds that no longer would recognize them, as it were. So, another very important point that maybe ties all of this together is how this music was transported or transmitted. I think most importantly, from its origins in Muslim Spain to the living traditions of today. This is still a living, breathing musical culture. Sephardic music has relied on what's known as generational transfer rather than written notation. So the oral mode of transmission enabled performers not only to internalize and build upon the lyrics, they could change the lyrics, the melodies, and performance techniques, and recreate them in strange lands, but it also allowed it to be this kind of portable entity. They eschewed the rigidity of the notated page, and the music, as a result, flourished in many directions, taking on local flavors very comfortably without competing against a really rigid style. This is something that ethnomusicologist Mark Slobin noted. He said, quote, "Basic to all Jewish musics is their close ties to the musical traditions of their non-Jewish neighbors. Among the far-flung networks of Jewish communities, none was more interactive with local musics than the Sephardic tradition, composed of descendants of Jews driven out of Spain in 1492. Up through the early age of sound recording, Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean mingled musically with surrounding peoples to the extent of becoming early recording stars who performed non-Jewish materials." I just want to make one note on terminology. Before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Mizrakhi Jews did not really identify themselves as a separate Jewish subgroup. In fact, they would characterize themselves as Sephardic, with, of course, some differences of minhag or custom from region to region, which was just as true among the Ashkenazim. And actually, today, some Mizrahi Jews, as we might call them, take exception to the term Mizrahi. Why? Because Mizrahi means Easterner, and of course, you wouldn't call yourself Easterner. That must be a designation, you know, foisted upon you by someone in the West. So there's a bit of a, you know, racial kind of undertone to that term. So a lot of Mizrahi Jews, if they're sensitive about this sort of thing, will just go by Sephardic. And I think that's a very important way to think about it as well, because this really is the Sephardic diaspora. So, I keep pointing over here. Here's the makam. Makam is an interesting word. It literally means place. And in Hebrew, there's a very similar word, makom, and that's not a coincidence at all. It's a melodic system or type comprising specific motives, pitches, patterns, and habitual phrases, as well as modulation possibilities from one makam to a next, or from one section of a makam to the next. There are 8 main families of makamat, which is how it's pluralized in the Arabic. Sometimes you'll see it makamot in some Jewish texts, but nevertheless, with a variety of modes outside of these families, as well as subfamilies combining aspects of 2 or 3 makamat. Makamat are built on jins, plural ajnaz. These are scale fragments of 3, 4, or 5 tones, what we might recognize in in Western music as a tetrachord, sort of the half of the scale. And all of this will make sense when we start to listen to some music. So let's actually, before we do that, let's return to that Kol Nidre that we heard. Let's see. Not working for some reason. Oh, there it goes. Okay, the Kol Nidre that we just heard. We can actually do a very rough breakdown of what was going on. So it starts Kol Nidre. Those 4 notes, I think, is what that was. Fits very nicely into this top system. Da, so da 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 da. So the first half you see would be known as Jins Hijaz, meaning that that's sort of the 4 notes that would comprise the Jins Hijaz flavor. All of this is probably Makam Hijaz, actually. But the first half, you have this evocative, very Eastern sounding da 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 da, which we hear in Hava Nagila and other things that we actually explored yesterday. And the second part is more of a natural minor sound. So if you go from the bottom, da da top. And that is characteristic of another makam, Nahawan, which you see down at the bottom, because what happens in this song too, or in this piece of music, is that it goes back and forth between the two. So basically, if you start at the top, da 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 da. So, sort of the reversal. On the bottom, hope this makes sense. At the bottom you have the Nahawan, sort of outlining the natural minor, then going into more of a, what we might recognize as a harmonic minor, but that's actually a parallel to the first part that we see at the top with the leading tone. So anyway, that's essentially what we're hearing, sort of the combination going back and forth. And this is pretty typical, actually. In a piece done in Makam Hijaz, you'll see them going back and forth between these two makamat. And again, it's the jins, or the ajnaz, that allows us to travel from one to the other very fluidly. And this is essentially the way that the makam theory works out. So, let's hear another piece of music in this particular mode. If I can find it here. Let's see. Okay. just to prove a point, was actually not a Jewish ensemble. Where do you think this comes from? Any guesses? Yes, no, maybe so? What's that?
It's a church.
Right, so it's actually, this particular piece is attributed to Sultan Abdulaziz, who's a Turkish ruler, essentially. He lived from 1830 to 1876. So, but the performance is by a group called Alan Shavarsh Bardesbarian. He's a very important oud player, and his Middle Eastern ensemble. There is actually a Turkish beat in it, so I can understand why that would be the case in the attribution, because in klezmer rhythms, we actually call the boom, that we call that a Turkish in the rhythm. So you're shaking your head.
It's not. It's so not. It's a churchak, which is a Romani dance. It's a very specific Roma dance, and maybe the origin was a Turkish Roma. Was a Turkish Roma.
That's what I'm thinking.
Song. Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking.
A Turkish Roma folk song.
Of course.
Yeah.
So again, the Roma and the klezmers, I'm trying to tie it all together. They interacted, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, as I mentioned yesterday, even this mode, which we identify in the Jewish world as the Fregish or the Ahava Rabbah, originated in Turkey and came by the way of the Tatars, a Turkish ethnic group during the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. So this is a great example of this kind of intermingling, you might call it, I don't want to call it mutt music, but I can't think of any other term at the moment. So all of these influences are coming together. But again, this sort of demonstrates how you can play around with these modalities in improvisation. But another thing that we see, relatedly, is microtonality, right? So this is, again, that maybe sliding in and out of notes that we, as Westerners, don't necessarily understand. But the makamat are strongly heptatonic, meaning that, as we saw in the previous slides, we can divide them into the main notes, and then there are other notes that kind of exist in between. The notes in between the notes, that's a way of thinking about microtones. So performers use finer microtones or quarter tones, notes between half steps, the conventions of which are passed down through oral tradition. So that's why, again, as Western listeners, we maybe don't pick up on them as a native listener might. And the microtones originate in vocal technique first, and they can be replicated on fretless string instruments, so like the oud and the violin, as we've already heard today, and other instruments that allow for note bending, such as the ney, which is a reed or cane flute, indigenous to the Middle East, or even a clarinet, which you might have heard in your lifetime as well. So as an example of microtonality, I thought we could play an interpretation of the next slide. This is a Moroccan rendition of the of Yona. If we wanted to characterize it as a maqam, which some Moroccan theorists don't appreciate, because they like to think of the system as distinct. But it does fit within what's called maqam nahawan, or the minor kind of tonality that we heard. So, here's what this sounds like, and see if you can pick up the note bending. So it begins with a blessing for the Haftarah.
ונשא בדבריהם הנאמרים באמת. ברוך אתה אדוני הבוחר בתורה ובמשה עבדו ובישראל עמו ובנביאי האמת והצדק. ויהי דבר אדוני אל יונה בן אמיתי לאמור, יעלת רעתם לפניי. ויקום יונה לברוח תרשישה מלפני אדוני, וירד יפו. וימצא אוניה בעד תרשיש, ויתן שכרה, וירד בה לבוא עמהם תרשישה מלפני אדוני, ואדוני.
You get the idea? Nice repetitive pattern. We'll get back to that in a moment. So this is a portion from just the beginning of the book of Jonah. And one of the interesting things to me about this is again, the kind of microtonality that's being used, meaning that there's a lot of embellishment, right? We might just hear it as ornamentation, but there are a lot of nuances going on. It reminds me of a recording I heard recently of I think he was either Syrian or perhaps an Iraqi chazan, who was going to present a melody for Adon Olam. And I don't know if you're familiar with that prayer, but anyway, he said that before he introduced his version, he wanted to sing the Ashkenazi version. So he says, as our Ashkenazi brothers and sisters like to sing, Adon Olam Hashem Malach, you know, using a lot of ornament, like they can't help themselves. That's sort of what we hear here. It's just indigenous to the sound, so much so that even in presenting a Western tune, which that particular tune comes from Russia, they have to embellish it in that way. Again, it's built on these conventions that are passed on through the oral tradition. Another thing just of interest about cantillation itself, which is what we just heard. So the chanting of these texts predates the reading, I should say predates the pneumatic notation that we see. So if you look on all of these Hebrew letters, I wish I had a pointer, maybe I'll just go over here.
There's a pointer right here.
Oh, how about that? Really fancy. Okay, well, I'll try to do that. Well, whatever.
It's not the best.
Well, you see this little wiggly line here, and all these things on the bottom and the top. All of that was added much later in the history of the textual transmission. If you've ever looked at a Torah scroll, for instance, there's nothing on there. It's just plain text, letter after letter. You know, they form words, but you don't know where the sentence begins or ends. You don't know where the vowels are supposed to be placed if you need any of that kind of help. And in fact, you know, as I mentioned, the act of chanting the text actually predates any of these signs that were added much later. The chanting probably dates back to the Second Temple, very early on in the Torah's transmission, in fact, and by extension all of the other biblical books that are chanted. But the addition of not only these, I'm going to give this back to you. Yeah. Thanks.
How can you know that it predates the Masoretic?
Right. So here's what's interesting. I'll get to what you're asking. So the Masoretes were the ones who added all this stuff between the 6th and the 10th century in the Common Era. They were active in Tiberias, in Jerusalem, and Babylonia. Masoretes basically means conservators. They were the ones who wanted to preserve a specific version of the text. Not only that, but they wanted to preserve a particular pronunciation of the text and a particular phraseology of the text. Because what we see with these pneumatic symbols, the te'amim as they're called in Hebrew, the tastes, or the accents, or trope signs, however you want to call them, they form kind of a musical grammar, where if you follow along, you can know, even without any of these external markings, how to parse, how to phrase, how to pronounce. And the Masoretes developed 28 different symbols that are used in this way, which is actually a kind of musical notation. I don't think we can take that for granted. The only caveat there would be that this musical notation is interpreted differently in every community. One of the reasons why we know that Jewish music absorbs influences from its surroundings wherever it happens to be is that the cantillation is not uniform from one community to another. Moroccan cantillation sounds very Moroccan, whereas Syrian sounds very Syrian, Lithuanian sounds very Lithuanian, Chinese sounds, no, Ashkenazi Jews in China. But anyway, the point is, the sound will actually be very different from place to place. And all of this was kind of codified in the 10th century by Moses, the Ben Asher school in the 10th century. And what's, I think, most interesting in terms of the transmission of the sound of the cantillation is that the Tiberius Masoretes probably didn't intend for every single squiggly line, as it were, every single noon, to be interpreted separately. As we'll hear again, just to demonstrate this, with the Moroccan chant, you actually hear more of a pattern. And if you're looking at the different symbols, you can see that they're going in different directions, but they're not always actually being interpreted musically. They're just kind of there. What's most important is the phraseology. So you find yourself sort of in a repetitive So that's very different actually than what we do in the Ashkenazi world. Again, Aaron Ben Asher and the Ben Asher school and Tiberius, who codified all of this, their intention wasn't necessarily for us to interpret everything, but we do in the Ashkenazi world. Does anyone know how to chant Haftarah? Okay, well I can do it. I get the melody in my mind. One moment. Vayhi divrei Adonai Elonei bet amitai lemor kum lech el nineveh ha'ir hagdola ukra aleha ki ata ratam lefanai. So in the Ashkenazi system, every single little thing is telling me to do something differently. That's not necessarily the case in the Sephardic world. Just a very important distinction. Why this is important, I think, culturally, historically, is that the way that the text is chanted, as we heard it in Morocco and elsewhere, is actually much more closely aligned with the way that the Quran is chanted. Certainly not an accident. So I'm going to play just some Quranic chant. You can hear maybe some similarities.
أنا العبد الذي كسب الذنوب وصدته المعاصي أن يتوبا أنا العبد الذي أضحى حزينا على زلاته دنفا كئيبا أنا العبد الذي سترت عليه صحائف لم يخف فيها الرقيب أنا العبد المسيء عصيت ربي فما لي الآن لا أبد النحيب أنا العبد المفرط ضاع عمري ولم أرعى الشبيبة والمشيب أنا العبد السقيم من الخطايا وقد أقبلت ألتمس الطبيب أنا العابد المخلف عن أناس حووا من كل معروف.
So you hear kind of the halted pattern going on. It's very similar.
Probably influence each other.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty amazing. When you take the words away, because this sounded like Arabic, I think, to many of us, because it was. You know, the Hebrew and the Arabic are somewhat, they're first of all sister languages, as we know. Arabic essentially grew out of Hebrew. but interchangeable in some ways, the melodic systems. And that's a very important point that I keep reiterating. So let's move on to the next of our 4 concepts, improvisation. So what role does improvisation play? The makamat, and this, by the way, that we just heard was again in Makam Hijaz, the Quranic chant. Makamat provides stereotyped patterns within and between ajnaz. Again, the smaller fragments within the makam. The structure provides space for creativity, or what's sometimes called composing in the moment. By the way, an improviser is a composer. In that moment, that person is composing. Let's not forget. Oriental, another term that we don't like to use anymore, that's why I put it in the scare quotes, but it's called Oriental tune construction sometimes, or the Gestalt approach, where pieces of music are conceived of as a whole rather than the sum of its individual parts. Melodies are constructed by placing groups of notes together rather than individual notes. So what this means is that rather than in the classical Western tradition where a composer just puts notes after notes and kind of thinks of it in that very linear structured way, an Oriental quote-unquote tune, that's what, by the way, Orientalist is the old term for people who study Islam and the Middle East. So I didn't make up the term. It's still used, unfortunately, the Oriental tune construction. But nevertheless, you will, instead of using single notes, use motifs and build around those. You can embellish motifs, you can develop on motifs, but basically you're working with a patchwork. Sometimes in the Jewish world we call it the mosaic approach. I think it's sort of a play on words, not only that you're kind of creating a mosaic with these shapes that already exist, but also mosaic being Moses, so that's kind of a cute play on words. And very importantly, in the beginning of a lot of these tunes, and sometimes in the middle as well, you'll hear what's called a taksim, which is basically an improvised rubato, as we call it, a rhythmically free element or section of music, usually performed as an introduction to a more rhythmic expression of the same makam. So it's kind of setting it up with this virtuosic display of improvisation. In vocal terms, the taksim is often called the mawal, which is the same thing, but it's with the voice instead of with an instrument.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, we're going to hear that. The Kol Nidre had it. Certainly the earliest example we heard, Shway Shway, had that as well. And we'll hear some examples too. But just a note on improvisation. What improvisation tells us about the Middle Eastern, or if you want to call it Mizrakhi world, now that I've sort of cast a little shade on the term, is that oral music societies, remember this music was transmitted primarily orally, they appreciate and expect improvisation as an element. It's one of the key elements of the music. Again, in distinction to Western music, where the performer tries to duplicate as precisely as possible what they think is the vision of the composer. So someone playing Beethoven today won't be that different from someone playing Beethoven 100 years ago or 100 years from now. That's not what is valued necessarily in these oral cultures. And the improvisation, of course, can communicate emotions as well as virtuosity, as well as displays of technical facility, and also allows the performers to spontaneously respond to one another, interact with one another. It's a wonderful thing. Now this reminded me, and I brought it for you, of a story that was told by very important Israeli musicologist Michal Smoira Cohn, who recalled when a Bedouin musician visited a class at the Jerusalem Reuben Academy of Music and Dance. The musician played a marvelously concentrated and highly inspired piece on a single-string bowed instrument. When he finished, the professor explained some details of the performance and asked the musician to play the same piece again. Bewildered, the Bedouin proceeded to play a new improvisation, which resembled the first but was not quite identical. So Smira Cohen goes on to relate, the experience illuminated for me the true significance of the art of performance. I realized that the supposedly primitive Bedouin knew better than all of us the real value of music. So what did she mean by this very provocative statement? The real value that she addressed is really part and parcel of these oral societies, these oral music cultures, where improvisation is really a fixture of not only music, but also storytelling, dance, instrument playing, songs. All of this together is an improvisational world. But with limits, right? You have to be within a particular maqam or a particular story pattern, you know? But you can play around with it. You can embellish. All of this is sort of minimized when we move into the written world of notation, of writing, whatever it might be. So here's an example that I think will show what we're talking about. Trying to get to the next slide here. So here are some Jewish women in Algeria. I don't know if anyone has ever hung a baby like that. Okay, try it sometime. So this is a selection from a prayer called Nishmat Kol Chai, the breath or the soul of all life, which is said traditionally in the morning liturgy. And this will be in Makam Nahawan, or the minor mode, as it were.
It's like the sleeves we've got now.
Oh, yes.
Totally.
Good idea.
Yeah, not a bad idea at all.
You have to wind them up.
תברך את שמך אדוני אלוהינו ברוח כל בשר תפאר ותרומם זכריך מלכנו תמיד מן העולם ועד העולם התהיל ובלעדיך אילנו מגואל ומושיע מודה ומציל ועונה ומרחם בכל עצה ומצוקה אילנו בחוזר וסומך אלא אתה שבת עניים אתה תשמע צעקת הדל תזיד תחשב.
So I think, if you're listening carefully, you can hear a bit of the structure of a melody, but there's a lot of stuff added on. And in fact, if we attempted to notate what was going on, it would be very difficult. Certainly, again, sort of showing how the written notation doesn't always match up with our ability to improvise. I'm reminded actually of a story of a very prominent cantor who was known for his great improvising in the Ashkenazi world, where improvisation in the cantor used to be a thing as well, who was a great composer, really, of cantorial music, but he didn't himself know how to write music or read music. So it was up to others to try to transpose what he, or transcribe, maybe transpose as well, but certainly write down what he was trying to, what he was presenting, and it always kind of was at odds with the recordings. It was sort of here, sort of there. That's, I think, the freedom in some ways of improvisation that transcends the ability of the written notation to capture. So here's another example. By the way, this is the Cantor singing here. His name is Andre Taib. He's a French-based Algerian and Moroccan singer. This is a group, or from an album by Nagila, which is, again, an Algerian, French, Moroccan ensemble. A group founded by percussionist Pierre-Luc Bensasson in 1998. And I think on this next recording, if I'm not mistaken, you'll hear some of the instruments involved as well. The oud, the string, the fretless string plucked instrument. You'll hear the ney, the flute, violin, and also some percussion. You saw the rick yesterday. I think we'll probably hear a little bit of that, a fancy tambourine, for a layman's understanding of the instrument. And also the darabuka, which is a hand percussion. And this is from another piece of the liturgy, from the Hallel of the festivals. Sorry, here we go. So again, you'll hear the improvisation in the beginning, now interaction between the singing and the playing. Moving right into the same mode, right here it's probably a jam or the major mode, from the improvisation right into a metrical exploration of the makam, right? So from improvisation to a more set tune. Long, and I know we're running out of time, so we'll move on to the next thing. So much more to say, obviously.
Was that Milchamocha, or I mean, that's what it sort of sounded like?
So it's not, but some of the same words probably popped in here or there. This is from the Hallel liturgy psalms that are sung on festivals. As we continue, let's go to our next slide. Heterophony. That's a fancy word for something that's maybe not so fancy. This is textures created through unison playing or singing with variation as opposed to harmony. So what we've heard so far, if you've been paying very close attention, is an absence of what we might say a chordal instrument. You don't hear a guitar strumming, you don't hear the piano, you know, that sort of thing. So the texture derives from the melodic instruments. It's a very much a melodic style of music. You have your melody and your rhythm, and with those, you create this very complex sound, as opposed to the West, which relies much more on harmony. So what might occur is what some scholars call unintentional polyphony, meaning that unintentionally you're creating multiple lines because the different people are playing the same thing but doing it in different ways, right? So you create this kind of unintentional polyphony, again, by simultaneous variation of a melodic line in multiple voices. Let's go to the next slide. So that brings us to the Baghdadi Jews, the Baghdadi Jewish community specifically of Mumbai, or what used to be called Bombay. So how did Sephardic Jews get all the way into India? Very interesting question, I think. So beginning in the 18th century, under the Mughal Empire, the Indo-Persian Empire in southern India, merchant traders from not only Baghdad, but also Aleppo, Syria, established Judeo-Arabic speaking communities, what we might call Mizrakhi Jewish communities, along trading networks and across Asia. So these communities grew in the 19th century under British rule, with Jews from Iraq settling in major trading centers such as Surat, Calcutta, Bombay, and Rangoon. Despite their success, though, in trade, these Baghdadi Jews struggled to really find a place for themselves in the rich tapestry of India. They styled themselves as what's sometimes referred to as the Arabian Jews of India. And after the Indian Rebellion against the British colonialists in 1857, the Baghdadis distanced themselves from the indigenous Indians and really identified with the British. And then following World War II, they desired to be perceived more as Europeans, again, trying to distance themselves. And were actually kind of torn because of the subsequent rise of nationalism, not only because of independence in India, but also Zionism. And they've always sort of occupied this liminal space, as it were, within Indian society. Just to put things in perspective, Jews have historically been the smallest religious minority in India. In 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, there were approximately 30,000 Jews in India. And these included 3 distinct Jewish populations. You may have heard of the Cochin Jews. They're the ones who look maybe most outwardly Indian to us, the oldest, longest standing Jewish community there. There's also the B'nai Israel, which consider themselves to be one of the lost tribes, and they have a distinct cultural identity as well. And then, of course, the Baghdadis. And since the establishment of the State of Israel, I think over 20,000 Indian Jews have migrated to Israel. So the population is even smaller than it used to be. And it is said that the few Baghdadi Jews who are still living in India really don't carry their Indianness very well. So they still retain this very Baghdadi kind of Iraqi style. I mention them because in this next recording we'll hear an example from the Baghdadi community. This is a singer, Rahal Muslea, who again preserves this Iraqi sound in the Indian context. But in this music, I think you'll hear a great example of heterophony. Again, multiple instruments and voice essentially playing the same thing or performing the same thing, but with variation, creating this kind of unintentional harmony or polyphony. So let me just find the track here. So this is a hallelujah, as it happens. I'm going to stop because the card tells me to. Of course I had more to say, but that's fine. There's something about the Syrian Jews as well. Don't worry about it. Maybe next time. Thank you.